Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, executive editor of TNSR. In the television series MASH, when Radar O'Reilly is eager to woo a woman who he thinks is more sophisticated than he is, Hawkeye advises him that whenever he is confronted with something he doesn't know about, he should nod sagely and say, "That's highly significant." Or if it's a question of culture, he should say, "Ah, bah." You can be forgiven if your approach to semiconductors has been similar to Radar's approach to culture. While many of us know that semiconductors are supposed to be important, few of us have a detailed understanding of just how it is that they contribute to the economy and in particular to national security. In this week's episode of Horns of a Dilemma, Chris Miller, the assistant professor of international history at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, explains exactly what it is about semiconductors that makes them so critical and what about the way and the places in which they're produced makes them an important national security consideration. Miller speaks based on his book, Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. This is a really informative discussion that will help us come away as better versed and better understanding in this critical technology. Let's listen in.
Thanks to all of you for coming to hear about how a very obscure technology has had some world historic impacts. You probably, unless you're an electrical engineer or a semiconductor expert, don't spend that much time thinking about semiconductors, but I can assure you that semiconductors spend a lot of time doing thinking for you. The reality is that for most of human history, we've had to rely on human bodies to do computing for us. When cavemen first wanted to compute, they could compute with their fingers by flipping them up and down to help them remember numbers, and that was efficient only if you wanted to count between 1 and 10. In the early parts of the 20th century, computer was a profession. You could become a computer. You could be employed by an insurance company or as an actuary, sit in an office building and do computation for that company. And over the course of the 20th century, as institutions had more and more data they were trying to process and remember, there was more and more demands for computers to play a role in that process. And the profession of computers was a very inefficient way, it turned out, to do that work. Computers in the 1920s demanded lunch breaks and holidays. They had to be fed occasionally, got sick. And so there was a growing demand for a better computing technology to emerge. In the middle of the 20th century, we used vacuum tubes to compute, light bulb-like devices that turned on and off. When they were on, they represented a 1. When they were off, they represented a 0, providing the ones and zeros that were at the origins of all digital computing. And throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s, vacuum tubes allowed tremendous advances in computing power. Advances that could be used to crunch data or to calculate artillery trajectories, as the most advanced computer in 1945 was used to do. But vacuum tubes also had their limits. If you went to the University of Pennsylvania in 1945 and looked at the world's most advanced computer called the ENIAC computer, funded by the US military to calculate artillery trajectories, you would have found a computer capable of remembering and processing several tens of thousands of ones and zeros at a time using these vacuum tubes, flipping on and off, 1 and 0, 1 and 0. And 10,000 might seem like a lot of ones and zeros to remember. Certainly it was better than any caveman flipping fingers up and down on their hands, or even better than a professional computer sitting in a Manhattan office building in the 1920s. But vacuum tubes had their limits as well. For one thing, they occasionally burnt out like light bulbs do. So too did vacuum tubes, since they're basically like a light bulb turning on and off. They also, because they emitted light when they turned on, attracted moths, which was a problem. If you wanted your vacuum tubes to work well, it required regular debugging, the origins of that phrase in our computing industry today. And so there was an intense demand to move beyond something that attracted moths and was hard to miniaturize and very power intensive to improve the computing process from cavemen's fingers to computers as a profession beyond vacuum tubes. In the early Cold War, the amount of funds and the amount of focus on improving computing technologies took a jump forward. And it was led above all by the need to put more computing in small spaces, like the nose of missiles or the guidance computers of spacecrafts. And so from the late 1940s all the way through the early decades of the Cold War, there was intense focus from the Pentagon and from NASA into how do we miniaturize computing power to let ever smaller devices have ones and zeros remembered more efficiently or processed more effectively on them. In 1947, 75 years ago this year, 3 scientists at Bell Labs invented a device that was better than a vacuum tube called a transistor, which is a electric circuit that can be turned on and off very efficiently, more efficiently than a vacuum tube. And about a decade later, first here in Texas and then a year later in California, 2 scientists invented ways to combine multiple transistors on a single piece of silicon, which ended up being a revolutionary development. It was the first chip founded in the late 1950s. Now, if you bought the first commercially available chip, which wasn't commercially available until the early 1960s, you would have had a chip with 4 transistors on it. 4 ones, 4 zeros, or some combination of ones and zeros in between. But if, like me, you have a smartphone in your pocket today, you will have at least 10 billion transistors in your pocket right now. That's a lot more computing power than you could have bought on the open market in the 1960s. And the process of turning chips from something with 4 transistors to something with 10 or 15 billion has, I think, been the most complicated manufacturing problem of human history. Today, if you want to build a chip with 10 billion transistors, you need to pack those transistors so closely together that they're microscopic in scale. If you buy a new iPhone, for example, you'll have 10 billion transistors, each of which is smaller than the size of a virus. And they're produced by the billions with almost perfect accuracy day after day. We've produced more transistors just in the last year than the combined total of all other manufactured goods in all of human history. We produce more transistors than there are cells in the human body. We're approaching the number of atoms on Earth in terms of the number of transistors we produce. We're not there yet, but that's the only limit that I can think of in terms of the number of comparison points for the number of transistors we produce. And the question of how do you do that? How do you produce so many transistors with extraordinary accuracy at such tiny scale has been the most difficult manufacturing challenge that we rely on. Now, when you think of the production of advanced technology, you probably don't think of manufacturing. At least I didn't when I started this book. I thought of tech as being in the software sphere, maybe in the cloud. It sounds sort of ethereal up there, far from the real world. But in fact, all computing is just a question of ones and zeros that are produced on silicon chips, electrical circuits being turned on and off, on and off, on and off, just like vacuum tubes in a 1945 computer, but now at a vastly greater scale. And so if you want to understand, I think, how this is possible, how it's possible that today almost anyone can buy 10 billion transistors to put in their pocket, you've got to understand how this manufacturing challenge was solved, how we got to the point where it's now pretty straightforward for a company to carve 10 billion transistors on a 1-inch squared silicon chip. Now, I mentioned that the earliest focus for miniaturizing computing power came from the defense industrial base in the United States, the desire to miniaturize computing so it could fit on the nose of a missile or fit in a spacecraft flying out of Earth's orbit. The first major order for semiconductors in the early 1960s was for the guidance computer in the Apollo spacecraft that flew to the moon. That was the first test case for chips. Sort of crazy that they relied on a completely untested technology to send people to the moon. In hindsight, I might not have done that, but it worked out okay. The second major order for semiconductors was in the guidance computer of the intercontinental ballistic missile called the Minuteman II, which was designed to send a nuclear warhead from the continental United States all the way to the Soviet Union. Thankfully, it never had to be used. But from this early military demand to miniaturize computing power came a series of technological innovations that set in motion what we now know as Moore's Law, named after Gordon Moore, the founder of Intel, or the co-founder of Intel, who in 1965, after he'd been in the industry already for a decade, noticed that the number of components on each chip was doubling annually. And therefore, he predicted that from 1965 to 1975, a similar exponential growth rate would continue. And he was proven absolutely right. And indeed, that exponential growth rate continued not only for one decade, but has continued all the way up to this day, such that every year or two, we get access to new chips that have a doubling or so of the computing power that they're capable of undertaking. And when you just put it in those terms, it doesn't sound that crazy. Things double, and we're used to things doubling to a certain extent. But exponential growth over a half a century long period is something that's basically unparalleled when you look across the rest of the economy. Imagine cars going twice as fast every 2 years, or houses being built twice as big every 2 years for the exact same price point. It's actually hardly anything in the economy has exponential growth of this nature, but our ability to access and produce computing power has, which is why, compared to the rest of the economy, we still make shirts more or less in the same way we did 50 years ago. Airplanes still look pretty similar as they did 50 years ago, but computing has been revolutionized in 50 years, precisely because of this exponential growth. And today, because computing is so cheap relative to 50 or 60 or 70 years ago, we put computing power in almost all manner of devices. Today, if you look at where semiconductors go, around 20% of chips by value, or 25%, go into smartphones, another 20% or so go into PCs. But then there are dozens of other use cases for semiconductors, which in the past didn't have computing power, but today are smarter because they do. Coffee makers, dishwashers, automobiles will often have dozens, if not hundreds, of chips inside. And the number of devices that now have computing, thanks to the fact that computing is close to free, is extraordinarily large. And we're seeing more and more devices being paired with chips as the cost of computing power falls ever further. And so today, even your coffee maker will have vastly more computing power than the most advanced computer in 1945, for example. And the chip inside of it will cost a couple of cents at most. So this has been an extraordinary transformation of our economy, certainly of our tech sector, and indeed most of the things we think of today when we think of technology wouldn't exist were it not for this extraordinary increase in the computing power we have access to. But making this possible was extraordinarily difficult. It's one thing to make a chip about this size with 4 transistors in it, like was done in the early 1960s by Fairchild Semiconductor in California, but developing the tools needed to make transistors the size of a virus by the billions and billions is a very different matter entirely. And today there are just a small number of companies that can produce the tools capable of carving transistors into pieces of silicon at this scale. 5 companies play the dominant role in the tool-making industry, 3 in California, 1 in Japan, and 1 in the Netherlands. And they have almost monopoly-like positions in their ability to produce tools with such extraordinary precision. For example, if you want to acquire an extreme ultraviolet lithography tool, which is a crucial tool for making the most advanced chips, you can only buy it from one company in the Netherlands. They have a 100% market share. Without their tools, you cannot make an advanced chip. You can't make a chip for iPhone. You can't make a chip for your PC. You can't make a chip that runs cloud computing processes and data centers. You need their tools. And there's one company in the world that knows how to make them. And only one company can make them because they're the most precise and complicated and expensive machine tools in human history. The lithography process in making semiconductors involves shining rays of light through a patterned mask to carve onto a chip the pattern of transistors that you want. And when the first chips were being fabricated in the 1960s or 70s, you could use visible light to carve patterns on the chip because visible light has a wavelength of several hundred nanometers. It was by far small enough to make the pretty large transistors you needed in the earliest chips. But now we've got transistors like on your iPhone, for example, that are measured in a handful of nanometers. So visible light is far too large to do the carving that's needed to make a chip on a smartphone. So we need extreme ultraviolet light with a wavelength of 13.5 nanometers to do the ultra-precise carving of the billions of transistors that you rely on for texting and emailing. Well, how do you produce light at 13.5 nanometers? It's an extraordinarily difficult process. First, you need an explosion of a tiny ball of tin measuring 30 millionths of a meter wide. You pulverize it with 2 blasts from one of the most powerful lasers ever deployed in a commercial device. It explodes into a plasma measuring several 100,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Then you collect the ultraviolet light that's emitted using the flattest mirrors humans have ever made, direct it via 13 different mirrors to the silicon chip, and then you've got a bit of carving that happens on your silicon chip. These machines cost $150 million each to produce. ASML, the Dutch company that makes them, produces a couple dozen a year. It takes multiple 747s to transport them from the factory that they're made in to their final assembly site. And this is just one of the tools you need to make chips. You also need tools that can lay down ultra-thin layers of chemicals and materials, just a couple of atoms deep, or cut canyons into the silicon a couple of atoms wide. This is the most precise manufacturing humans have ever done, and we're able to do it with almost perfect accuracy. Of the 10 billion transistors on your iPhone chip, almost all of them will function exactly as intended. It has to be that way or else the chip wouldn't work, which means that the accuracy with which we can today carve transistors into chips is just extraordinary. Now, because this supply chain is so complicated, because the machinery is so complex, because the software tools needed to design a chip are so specialized, the number of companies involved is, on the one hand, quite large across the supply chain, from design to the machine tools to the actual fabrication process, but in other ways, quite limited, because at each step in the process, there is often 1 or 2, or in some cases 3 firms that control the entire industry. In the manufacture of the machine tools I mentioned, there are 5 companies without which it's basically impossible to make an advanced chip. You need tools from all of them. If you want to design a chip, you need software tools that are provided by just 3 companies, all based in the United States. And if you want to manufacture chips, well, there's only a small number of companies that know how to manufacture the most advanced chips. When it comes to memory chips, there are 4 or 5 companies that can produce the most advanced memory chips. Korea is the largest player in this sphere, produces around 40% of the world's memory chips. And if you want to manufacture a processor chip of the type that you'd find in a smartphone or in a PC, well, one company in the world produces 90% of the most advanced processor chips. And that company is the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, which today has almost all of its production on the island of Taiwan. TSMC produces not only 90% of the most advanced chips, but also around 1/3 of the new computing power the world adds each year is produced by this one company. It's the most important company, I think you could argue, in the entire world economy. 4 letters, TSMC, that most people have never heard of. And yet, in fact, you depend on them for your daily life. Your smartphone almost certainly has a TSMC-produced chip inside. 1/3 or so of computers, PCs, have a TSMC-made processor inside. When it comes to data centers, it's very difficult to run an advanced data center without TSMC-produced chips inside. Cell phone towers are hugely dependent on chips that TSMC produces. The world economy could not function without chips fabricated by TSMC on the island of Taiwan, which, as you may have heard, might not be the safest place to produce all of the world's chips. Now, if you ask yourself, well, how was it that this small island became the center of world chip making? That's a story that you need to start telling 50 years ago. The chip industry was founded in Texas and California, but it was actually an international industry from its earliest stages. The earliest chip firms did all of their fabrication of chips, the actual manufacturing, in-house, but they wanted to find lower labor costs for assembling the chips into packages. So you take a piece of silicon and you glue it into either a ceramic or a plastic package before you put it in a device. And that process of packaging was in the past quite labor intensive. And so from the early 1960s, just a couple of years, 4 years after the invention of the first integrated circuit, Fairchild Semiconductor in California opened its first offshored assembly facility in Hong Kong. And since then, there's been a very deep relationship between chip designers in the United States, especially in Silicon Valley, and assembly and later fabrication capacity in East Asia. Hong Kong was the first place in East Asia to play a big role in the assembly process, but it was soon followed by Singapore, by Korea, by other countries in Southeast Asia like Malaysia, and then most importantly for our purposes today, by Taiwan. And the Taiwanese government by the 1960s was focused on trying to attract as much electronics investment as possible, because in the 1960s, it wasn't only clear that electronics was a crucial business for the future. It was also clear that if you were sitting in Taiwan looking at trends in international politics in the late 1960s, you were getting very, very nervous about how the world looked. Put yourself in Taipei in the late 1960s. The US is losing the war in Vietnam. It's become clear that Chiang Kai-shek's armies are not going to reconquer the mainland. Quite the contrary. China has, to a certain extent, stabilized under Mao Zedong, although the radicalism of the Cultural Revolution is beginning to make you nervous about what Mao Zedong's plans actually are. Richard Nixon, the US president, has promised to draw down forces from Vietnam and draw down forces from across Asia, and the Taiwanese government faced a very difficult dilemma. How do we provide for our security in this new era? How do we provide for our security when the US, our primary guarantor of security, is promising to pull back from Asia? And the answer was, well, we don't know if Americans are willing to defend Taiwan, but we can be confident they're willing to defend Texas Instruments. And so the Taiwanese government was very aggressive in trying to attract US electronics firms, including Texas Instruments, to set up facilities in Taiwan. And from the late 1960s, 1969, TI, for example, had an important assembly facility right outside of Taipei. Now, at the time, Taiwan was just one of many countries in Southeast Asia that was trying to attract electronics investment. But it turned out that the Taiwan-Texas Instruments connection was rather important, because one of the key executives at Texas Instruments at the time was a gentleman named Morris Chang, a name that probably few of you know, though all of you ought to know. I hope I'll convince you to remember his name after this talk, because Morris Chang is the most underestimated entrepreneur of, I think, the last 100 years. Born in mainland China, fled to Hong Kong during World War II, then to Chongqing, the capital of the Republic of China government during the war. After the communists took power, he fled again to Hong Kong and then enrolled at Harvard, where he was the only Chinese student in his class in 1950. He spent a year studying Shakespeare, majoring in English literature before he gave that up to focus on something more practical, he decided, and transferred down the street to MIT, where he began studying physics and electrical engineering. After graduating, he got a job in electronics and was shortly thereafter hired by Texas Instruments and moved down to Dallas, where he played a critical role in building up TI's ability to manufacture chips effectively. And although today we take for granted, we don't even think about the fact that TSMC can straightforwardly print for us 10 billion transistors on a chip. In the early days of the chip industry, the most difficult part of the process was actually manufacturing the chips so that they would work. And Morris Chang, compared to all of his peers at TI, was renowned for his knack at making manufacturing work. He had the best intuition on the assembly line. He had a magical touch, people thought, when it came to tweaking manufacturing processes so that chips that in the past would be 50% defective ended up being 90% functional. And as a result, he very rapidly rose through the ranks at TI and played a major role in TI's decision to open a facility in Taiwan in 1969. Over the course of his career at TI, he'd done a PhD at Stanford, where he had a couple of friends who were from Taiwan, and they'd convinced him that better than Singapore, Taiwan was the place to open up an assembly facility. And so he visited Taiwan first in 1968 as part of a TI delegation to scout out assembly facilities in Taiwan. And over the next decade, he got to know the Taiwanese political leadership quite well, because he was one of their most important partners in trying to build up an electronics industry in Taiwan. Then in the 1980s, TI made the greatest mistake in business history of the 20th century by passing over Morris Chang for the CEO job. He was second in line, passed over, and so left TI and was casting out for something else to do, looking for another job. He was already at really close to the pinnacle of the chip industry. Being second in command at TI was at the time about as close as you can get to the top. So he was looking for a new challenge. And he was thinking at the time about a new business model for chip production, because for most of the first several decades of chip making, companies designed and manufactured chips in-house. We did both the design and the manufacture. But Morris Chang, as early as the 1970s, was already thinking through an alternative business model. And his model was Johannes Gutenberg, the person who invented the printing press. What Gutenberg's innovation was to realize that authors of books didn't have to be people who printed books, and you could mechanize the printing process, opening up authorship to a much wider number of writers. And Chang wanted to do the exact same thing for chip design. He said, I'll do the manufacturing and let other people do the chip design, which would be great for his customers since they didn't have to learn how to manufacture chips, an extraordinarily difficult task. They didn't have to invest in a chip making facility, which was getting more and more expensive every year. And great for Chang too, because he could make more chips with more customers, learn more about the chip making process as he produced more chips, and thereby gain an edge over his competitors because he had higher volumes than they did and benefit from economies of scale. He took this idea to his friends in the Taiwanese government. They gave him a blank check to start a new company, and in 1987, TSMC was founded with this revolutionary new business, designing chips, only producing them for other customers. And Chang turned and hired a bunch of his old colleagues at TI to set up TSMC's facilities, and he turned to a number of new customers, companies that previously hadn't been in the chip business, saying, you don't need to manufacture chips, just design them. That's comparatively the less capital-intensive part, arguably the easier part, and I'll manufacture them for you. In the 30 years since, TSMC has risen from being a small company with relatively lagging technology to the world's most advanced producer of processor chips and the world's largest producer of chips as a whole. It's a company without which the global economy would grind to a halt. And Chang, who only recently retired, well, he says he retired, although when I last spoke with him, it was in TSMC's offices. So I don't think he's actually fully retired, but he only recently retired from the chairman job, has played a fundamental role in establishing TSMC at the center of the world's chip industry. And TSMC, like Chang himself, has had a very interesting role, not only in its relationship with Silicon Valley, which is still its largest customer. Apple, NVIDIA, AMD, Qualcomm are among TSMC's largest customers, but also a rising player in the world chip industry, which is China, right across the Taiwan Straits. Until recently, TSMC's second largest customer, right behind Apple, was Huawei. And for most of the past decade, many of TSMC's most important growth markets have been selling more and more chips to China. Because although you might think of China as a technological superpower, and maybe in some ways that's true, China is crucially reliant on the importation of chips from the United States, from South Korea, but above all from Taiwan. And today, China spends as much money importing chips as it spends importing oil. There's no technology on which China is more dependent on outsiders. If you look across the chip supply chain, China is hugely reliant not on the importation of chips, but also if China wants to produce chips domestically, on the import of machine tools, of software, of ultra-purified chemicals, of silicon wafers. China can't make anything close to advanced chips without accessing US, Japanese, and Dutch technology, which Chinese leaders over a decade ago realized was a horrifying vulnerability if you predicted, as some people did, an era of growing tension between China and many of its neighbors. And if you study Chinese foreign policy, you'll often find people talk about the Malacca dilemma that China faces. It has to import much of its oil through the Straits of Malacca and other choke points that create a risk of China being cut off from oil. But I think if you look at Chinese policy over the past decade, you'll find that Chinese leaders are much more concerned about a blockade measured in bytes than a blockade measured in barrels. Because the reality is that China has no way to source advanced chip-making technology without the approval of the United States, which it's found to its horror over the past couple of years as the US has ratcheted up restrictions on chip-making technologies, transfer to China, and the transfer of advanced semiconductors to China. Now you might ask, well, how is the US able to cut off China from advanced chips if the world's most advanced chips are made in Taiwan and many are made in Korea as well? But because the Taiwanese and Koreans are hugely reliant on the import of tools, manufacturing tools like the lithography machine I described to you from Japan, the United States, and the Netherlands, they can't operate their chip-making facilities without the approval of those three countries because they simply can't get the tools needed to produce them. And so the US has discovered over the past decade or so that it has extraordinary extraterritorial power in the chip industry any advanced chip-making facility in the world can't function without U.S. tools, can't function without U.S. or Japanese chemicals, can't function very well without chip design software from the United States. And so to a dramatic degree, the U.S. has been trying to cut off its rivals, Russia, but also China, from accessing the most advanced chip-making tools. Why would the U.S. care about chip-making tools, you might ask? What's the big deal if China can make better smartphones or more PCs? And it isn't the case anyway that all of Apple's smartphones are assembled in China, and so China gets access to those chips. Well, that's certainly true. And all of the chips that China is importing, many of those are actually assembled into electronics that are sent all around the world. And no one is trying to change how that trade is structured. But chips aren't only useful for consumer goods, for your coffee maker or for your smartphone. Although today only 2% or so of chips go into defense or aerospace uses, there's no more technology that will be critical. There's no technology that will be more critical for the future of military power than semiconductors. And if you ask yourself what most differentiates military systems today from military systems half a century ago, the answer is obvious. It's computing power. Compare a fighter jet today to a fighter jet 50 years ago. They don't fly that much faster. They don't have much larger payloads. The radar is a bit better, but that's a semiconductor issue. The key difference is that the sensors, the communication, the computing, both in the airplane and in the weapon systems, the ability to transfer information from the satellites to people spotting targets on the ground, back up to the airplane, that's all a question of computing, communications, and sensors, which is a question of semiconductors. And just as semiconductors have revolutionized warfare over the past 50 years, to the extent now we take it for granted that it's possible for many of the world's militaries to fire a missile and accurately hit a target hundreds of miles away. It was an extraordinarily difficult challenge 50 years ago, but we take that for granted. The next decade or two will also see warfare transformed by new applications of computing power to military systems. Imagine, for example, a drone autonomously flying through contested airspace. It needs to understand where it is, even after its GPS is jammed. It needs to understand where it's going, identify threats that it faces, find targets on the ground, communicate to the extent possible, given the jamming it's likely to face with other sensors on different platforms, identify targets, make decisions about whether or not to engage them, potentially even in the future, engage them autonomously. Well, all that requires a whole lot of semiconductors, advanced processors to process the software that's growing more and more complex every day, huge memory demand to remember the data that's being processed on the drone, and tons of sensors, LiDAR sensors, radar sensors, infrared sensors, and sensors are all about semiconductors. To process all the signals that a drone like that will be bringing in is fundamentally a question of advanced semiconductors. And so when all of the world's militaries think about the future of defense technology, they're thinking about greater and greater reliance on computing and sensors, which means greater and greater reliance on semiconductors. And as the US military is thinking about how to retain what remains of its military edge in Asia, where it's guaranteed to be outcompeted in terms of quantity of systems. China will build more ships, it will build more missiles, it will build more drones. The only hope the US has for retaining its edge is by more intelligently deploying computing power to military systems. And so if you sit in the Pentagon, the only edge you've got is your semiconductor technology, which is why the US government over the past decade has been trying to defend that edge more aggressively than at any point since the early Cold War. Now today, China, as I described to you, is really quite far behind in most parts of the semiconductor supply chain, hugely reliant on importing machine tools, very reliant on importing software design tools, most types of chip design as well, China imports rather than produces domestically. But the Chinese government, since identifying this vulnerability almost 10 years ago, has been pouring tens of billions of dollars a year into an effort to domesticate the technology that it currently lacks. The success of this policy thus far is mixed at best. I think there are some successes and a fair number of failures along the way, but there's no government that's putting more money into domesticating a chip industry than China's. And given China's vast role in the electronics industry, the fact that most of our electronics are assembled in China using an increasing number of Chinese-produced components, I think there's a strong argument to be made that China has a very good shot at moving up the value chain in semiconductors and beginning to domesticate many of the technologies that it currently lacks. But as of last month, the US government has dramatically tightened yet again the restrictions on the transfer of semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China. Now it's illegal to transfer the most advanced GPU chips, which are used in AI applications in data centers, to China. The US is trying to call a halt to China's development of AI by cutting off the ability of China to acquire the chips necessary. And the US has also dramatically tightened the transfer of software tools and machine tools to China for the exact same reason. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, how can you call a halt to the development of AI? Isn't AI all about data and algorithms? Isn't data the new oil, as is often cited in newspapers? Well, I think that's a profound misreading of what's driven the revolution in artificial intelligence over the past decade. Ask yourself this. There's no doubt we have many more applications of artificial intelligence today than 10 years ago. Is it because we've got an order of magnitude more data? Well, no, there's always been lots of information. The problem is actually turning information into ones and zeros. That's a memory problem, not an information problem. Is it because computer programmers are an order of magnitude smarter than they were a decade ago? Well, I grant that there have been some advances, but probably not an order of magnitude of advances. Or is it that we're able to process more AI because we've got an order of magnitude more transistors in the chips that AI applications are running on? That has been the key driver of the spread of AI across society and economy over the past decade. There are more transistors to work with, more transistors to remember data, more transistors to process data, and therefore more intelligent applications that we have access to. And so long as the US tries to cut off China's access to advanced chips or the ability to produce advanced chips at home, and as long as China fails to replicate these technologies domestically, which I think it will fail over the next couple of years, over a longer time horizon is much more uncertain, it will struggle to harness the transistors it needs to crunch data and process data in a way that high-performance computing applications today require. So you probably don't think of the United States as a manufacturing superpower, and in many ways the United States isn't a manufacturing superpower, but when it comes to manufacturing transistors, you can't do it without US technology, and the US has a huge lead over almost every rival, and has especially a huge lead over China, in large part because the other countries who make the machines you need to make lots and lots of transistors by the billions and billions are either in Japan or the Netherlands, two close US allies. So in conclusion, I'd like to suggest to you that when you think about tech and your mind goes to Facebook or to TikTok, you're really misunderstanding what's at play. TikTok is sort of epiphenomenal. What really matters is the tremendous increase of transistors that has made all of the consumer internet and software tools we take for granted possible. And the production of these transistors is getting harder and harder and more expensive every year. And yet, nevertheless, the semiconductor industry is giving us vast increases on an annual basis, just like Gordon Moore predicted 1965, over half a century ago. But unlike most of the past decades, the challenge of producing semiconductors is no longer just a question of what science can produce and what industry can cost effectively manufacture. It's also a question today of politics, because it's impossible now to disentangle the production of semiconductors from the intensifying US-China competition, which in both Beijing and Washington is seen in no small part as a competition over semiconductor technology. And it's impossible also to disentangle that from the question of Taiwan, which is not only the world's most important chip maker, but also the most important chip maker for the United States and for China. So you might not do a lot of thinking about semiconductors, but I hope that you'll think a bit more about them after this talk, because they don't only do a lot of thinking for you, which they do on a regular basis, but if you don't think about them, and if we as a country don't think more about them, we're going to find ourselves in a much less advantageous place to take advantage of the incredible social and economic transformations that they have enabled since the days in the 1960s when you could have 4 transistors on the most advanced chip. It's been a long way, a long period of travel to the present of 10 billion transistors on a chip. And there's still a pretty clear pathway to a point in 2030 or so where we're going to have continuing doubling every 2 years of the number of transistors that will fit on the chip inside of your smartphone. But making sure that continues, making sure that the geopolitical ramifications of who controls that technology are considered. Those are the 2 great challenges, I think, of our time. And so I would encourage you in closing to think more about semiconductors in recognition of all the thinking that they do for you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.